Every craving tells you the same lie. This feeling will never end unless you give in. Science says that's false. Today, I'll show you why waiting just 10 minutes can completely change what your brain does next. Meet David. He's 34 years old. He's tried to quit smoking 9 times. The first attempt lasted 3 days. The second, a week. The longest, almost 4 months. Every time he quits, he tells himself the same thing. This time is different. And every time, something happens. A stressful day, a fight, a lonely evening. 1 cigarette becomes soon, 2 becomes a whole pack. Then comes the guilt. Why can't I just stop? Maybe you're asking yourself that question too. Maybe your addiction isn't cigarettes. Maybe it's alcohol, pornography, online gambling, your phone, junk food. Different addiction, same feeling. You know it's hurting you, yet when the craving arrives, it feels stronger than your own decisions. David thinks he has a willpower problem, but he's wrong. And if you've ever struggled with an addiction, there's a good chance you're wrong too. Because what if the problem isn't your character, but your brain? Today, we're going inside David's brain to discover why cravings feel almost impossible to resist, and a surprisingly simple strategy that can help weaken them in just 10 minutes. David throws away his cigarettes. For the first few hours, he feels amazing. He tells himself, "I'm finally free." Then something ordinary happens. He makes coffee, and suddenly he wants a cigarette. Not because he needs nicotine at that exact moment, because his brain has learned that coffee and cigarettes belong together. Later that afternoon, his boss criticizes his work. Within seconds, another craving appears. On the drive home, another one. After dinner, another one. David starts believing something terrifying. I'll never escape this. But here's what he doesn't know. His brain has been practicing this habit thousands of times. Every cigarette, every drink, every scroll, every bet strengthened a connection inside his brain. Over time, those connections became automatic. Scientists call these conditioned cues. Think of them like shortcuts. Coffee, cigarette. Stress, alcohol. Phone notification, social media. Nighttime, pornography. Your brain loves shortcuts. The more often it repeats one, the stronger it becomes. That's why addiction can feel automatic. Not because you're weak, because your brain has become incredibly efficient. And that's both the problem and the good news. Because what the brain learns, the brain can relearn. But first, we need to understand why fighting cravings usually makes them worse. The smell of fresh coffee fills the air. Almost instantly, David feels it. A craving. It seems ridiculous. He wasn't even thinking about cigarettes, so why now? Because David's brain wasn't reacting to the cigarette, it was reacting to the memory of the cigarette. Over the years, David's brain quietly built connections. Coffee meant smoking. Stress meant smoking. Driving home meant smoking. These moments became triggers, not because David chose them, because his brain learned them through repetition. Imagine walking through a grassy field. The first time, there's no path. The 10th time, you flattened the grass. After hundreds of walks, there's a clear trail. Your brain works in much the same way. Every addictive habit is like walking the same path again and again and again. Eventually, your brain stops asking whether it should take that path. It simply follows it. David isn't consciously deciding to crave a cigarette. His brain has already started walking down the old trail. But if that's true, why doesn't logic stop it? David knows smoking is harmful. He knows it damages his lungs. He knows it costs money. He knows he promised himself he'd quit. So why doesn't that knowledge win? To answer that, we need to meet 2 very different parts of David's brain. On one side, a toddler. On the other, a calm adult. The toddler has one job. I want relief. Right now. No waiting, no consequences, just relief. The adult thinks differently. It remembers tomorrow. It cares about health, family, goals, the future. Every time David feels a craving, these two sides begin arguing. The toddler screams, "I need a cigarette." The adult replies, "No, you'll regret it." Have you ever tried arguing with a toddler in the middle of a tantrum? Logic rarely wins. The louder you shout, the louder they cry. That's exactly what many people do with cravings. They fight them. They wrestle with them. They try to force them away. Ironically, that often makes the craving feel even stronger because whatever we keep focusing on, our brain treats as important. Imagine someone saying, "Whatever you do, don't think about a pink elephant." Too late. Your brain immediately created one. Cravings work in a surprisingly similar way. The harder David tries not to think about smoking, the more his brain keeps bringing smoking to his attention. So maybe the goal isn't defeating the craving. Maybe it's simply surviving it. And that's where everything changes. Because there's one simple trick that gives David's adult brain just enough time to catch up. This time, David doesn't say no. Instead, he says something unexpected. Maybe. Maybe just not for the next 10 minutes. That tiny sentence changes everything. Notice what David didn't say. He didn't promise he'd quit forever. He didn't declare war on the craving. He simply postponed the decision, and that matters. Because cravings behave a lot like waves. They rise, they grow, they reach a peak, then they begin to fall. The problem is, most people act while the wave is still rising. David decides to wait. He takes out his phone, sets a timer, 10 minutes. Now he has one job, not quitting forever, just reaching the end of that timer. But there's one catch. He can't spend those 10 minutes staring at the clock. His brain needs something else to do, something interesting, something demanding, something that breaks the old pattern. So David grabs his trainers and heads outside. 5 minutes into a brisk walk, he notices something strange. The craving hasn't disappeared, but it isn't shouting anymore. It's whispering. The wave has already started to pass. The first minute feels like forever. David's mind keeps drifting back to the cigarette. Maybe just one. You can start quitting tomorrow. You've already had a stressful day. The craving is still trying to negotiate. But David made himself one promise. For the next 10 minutes, he isn't making any decisions. He's simply following the timer. By the third minute, his breathing becomes deeper. His heart begins to settle. Something interesting is happening. His brain is becoming busy with something else. Not because walking is magical, but because attention is limited. Your brain can only focus intensely on so many things at once. The more completely David gives his attention to something else, the less attention remains for the craving. This is why distraction works, not because it erases the urge, but because it stops feeding it. Think of a craving like a campfire. Every time you keep thinking about it, you're adding another log. The fire grows, but when you shift your attention, you stop adding fuel. Without new fuel, even a large fire begins to die down. By the 6th minute, David notices something surprising. The craving is still there, but it no longer feels like an emergency. Instead of shouting, it's quietly sitting in the background. And that's exactly what he needed, because now his thinking brain has time to catch up. Walking isn't the only option. Tomorrow, David might choose something completely different. Maybe he'll call his brother. Maybe he'll work on a crossword puzzle. Maybe he'll play his guitar. Maybe he'll do 20 push-ups. Or maybe he'll simply step outside, close his eyes, and notice 5 things he can see. 4 things he can touch, 3 things he can hear, 2 things he can smell, and 1 thing he can taste. The activity itself isn't the secret. The secret is interrupting the old pattern. Every craving expects the same ending: trigger, craving, habit. David is teaching his brain a new ending: trigger, choice. And every time he repeats it, that new pathway becomes a little stronger. But what happens after the timer finally reaches 0? Does the craving disappear forever? Not quite, but something much more important begins to happen.
The timer beeps. David stops walking. He checks in with himself. The craving hasn't completely disappeared, but something has changed. It no longer feels impossible to resist. The wave has passed. For the first time in a long time, David realizes something. The craving wasn't a command. It was just a feeling, and feelings don't last forever. This is one of the most important lessons addictions can teach us. A craving always promises permanence. This feeling will never go away unless you give in. But that's a lie. Like every wave, it rises, it peaks, and eventually, it falls. The problem is that most people never stay on the surfboard long enough to find out. David just did, and his brain noticed. Every time David delays, instead of automatically giving in, his brain learns something new. Scientists call this neuroplasticity. You don't need to remember the word, just remember what it means. Your brain is constantly changing. Every decision you repeat strengthens one pathway, while allowing another to grow weaker. For years, David practiced smoking. Now, he's practicing recovery. 1 decision at a time, 1 craving at a time, 1 10-minute timer at a time. Recovery isn't built in one extraordinary day. It's built in hundreds of ordinary moments that most people never see. Will this 10-minute rule cure every addiction? No, and it's important to be honest about that. If you're struggling with addictions like alcohol, opioids, or other substances that can cause dangerous withdrawal symptoms, this technique is not a substitute for professional treatment. Recovery may require medical care, therapy, medication, or support groups, and seeking that help is a sign of strength, not weakness. But for many cravings, whether they're for nicotine, social media, junk food, pornography, gambling, or other habits, this strategy can be the difference between reacting automatically and choosing intentionally. It gives your brain something addiction tries to take away: time. And in that time, you get something even more valuable: a choice. Imagine David 1 year from now. He probably won't remember the cigarette he didn't smoke today, but his brain will. Because every time he waited, every time he delayed, every time he chose something healthier, he rewrote a tiny part of his story. Recovery isn't one heroic decision. It's hundreds of ordinary decisions made when nobody is watching, 10 minutes at a time. So here's my challenge to you. The next time a craving shows up, don't fight it. Don't surrender to it either. Simply say, maybe later, but not for the next 10 minutes. Set a timer. Move your body, occupy your mind, ride the wave, and then come back and tell us what happened, because your story might be the reason someone else doesn't give up today. If this video helped you understand your brain a little better, subscribe to Dopamine Dial. Every week we explore the science behind addiction, mental health, and behavior, so you can understand your brain and make lasting changes, one small step at a time.